Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Farah, and welcome and good morning to all of you, which really is a packed house. So my talk today is about open plan, and what I say is the death of the open plan office going forward. There's a key philosophy in my team, and that is that change is constant. Now that sounds really trivial, but it's actually fundamental for every company working in a market environment subject to constant change to recognize this and to figure out how to deal with this, to try to understand change, because only if we understand change can we adapt to it accordingly and make sure that we as businesses survive and thrive in the long term. Now, just to illustrate how quickly our world is changing, this is the Google Street View project, which was started only back in 2007. And if you Google funny Google Street View images, you will find all kinds of images that are certainly not safe for work. So it took a while for me to find this one, which is some guy randomly hanging on a wire on a road in Mexico. And I think it's really fascinating how Google has managed to go along all these different roads across the world, and you can go on there and see what the road looks like in northern Sweden just as much as Mexico, Argentina, and the rest of the world. Looking ahead, this is Project Tango. This was released just a few weeks ago by Google, and it's kind of the evolution of this trend, and it's a phone that can map interior spaces. It takes 250,000 readings of the interior space every second to create maps of the indoors. And this is really Google's first foray into mapping the great indoors. You know, we're all very, very used to using GPS and using our phones as we navigate the outdoors, but the indoor space is really a black spot. And that's where these IT companies are now moving in there to develop technology such as this phone, which is extremely powerful and for me really illustrates how quickly our world is moving forward when it comes to technology that impacts the built environment. Now, change is constant, but context is variable. And that's the second very important point. It's relatively easy to understand the core trends shaping the future of our world. Climate change, urbanization, aging population, and so forth. It's much, much harder to translate what those trends mean for a specific context, for a business, for a market, or for a project that we're working on. So that always leads to one specific question, that is, what does our future look like? And the our can be, again, anything, your company, your market, your sector, but it's essentially the question that we always try to answer in our work in the Foresight team. So today I want to look at the workplace. And the more I started researching this, the more I was reminded of chicken farms, you know, things being crammed in, more people working in the same space and so forth. Now that might not be a bad thing if you're only looking for a good chicken and a good egg. But if you're looking for something more than that, then maybe we have to rethink a little bit where we're going. So let's look at the facts and the status quo when it comes to workplace to start off with. This is the first purpose-built office building in the UK. Built in 1726, it's the old Admiralty, the Ripley building, which now houses the Department for International Development. The first purpose-built office block was Somerset House, which you all know. And it was really a response to the emergence of large-scale organizations such as the Royal Navy that these kind of purpose-built offices first emerged. And of course, since then, we have moved along in many, many different ways. If we think about the dominant design for offices today, it's actually the open plan design. And if we look at the statistics, about 70% of people in the UK and the US work in open plan offices. Now that allows us to ask one specific question, one very, very important question. Is this design the right design for the type of work that's happening today and for the requirements of the workforce and the organizations housing them? One key thing to consider when it comes to open plan is workplace density. And this is a graph by the British Council for Offices that tracks density in same buildings over time. And as this line here goes down, density is actually going up because this kind of depicts the amount of space per workstation. You can clearly see that from 2009 to 2010, this is kind of where the financial crisis hit, density has increased quite considerably. And it's questionable whether it will ever increase again. So higher density, but actually in a lot of spaces, quite low occupancy. So this is a workstation next to mine, and there's one person working on a row for 8 people. This is insane. You know, we live in a city like London where space is at an absolute premium. So we really need to question ourselves if having these type of workstations empty because people are out for coffee, they're in a meeting, they're working remotely, they're at the client side, you know, whether that really makes sense or whether there's not a different way to design our spaces and crucially the proportion of spaces. So what? So why is this important? Why should we bother? You know, why should we really think about this? The key thing is that workspaces play a crucial role in culture, how well we perceive our organization, how motivated we are, how productive we are, how well we collaborate, and so forth. So it's absolutely fundamental on how workplaces actually operate when it comes to all kinds of different things. So thinking about open plan, let's first of all consider the good. The first thing it does is certainly increase collaboration between people who are in the same space. It's easier to communicate with people, it's easier to approach people, and so forth. It also sends a certain message. So having an open plan design, having a transparent design, says something about your organization. It reduces operational costs because you can squeeze more people in, and it's also easier to change the interior fit out. So there certainly is some perceived benefits when it comes to this type of design. Thinking about the bad, there's again, the predominant one is probably uncontrolled interruptions of people. You know, you sitting at your desk, and you probably all know this, someone comes to you, there's a noise somewhere, there's a door opening, the coffee machine is running again, you're constantly being interrupted. And if you're doing complex tasks, that's a big, big problem in terms of how it impacts your concentration, the ability to be productive, and so forth. Health is also a factor. Some studies say that open plan offices lead to about 64% more sick days because people feel, less comfortable, the well-being is affected, and so forth. Productivity can be affected by up to 20%. And obviously noise is a huge issue. If you think about open plan offices, everyone around my space is now wearing these 250-pound Bose noise cancelling headphones, and they're kind of the new walls. You will walk to your office and everyone's wearing headphones because we're trying to figure out how to deal with this new problem we've created, which is noise interruption, which happens all the time in these type of spaces. Of course, it is again very, very context dependent. If you work in a call center, for example, it might actually be better if you've got people around you because the task that you might be doing is a little bit mundane and you want to feel that you're in an environment that is social and so forth. So it is context dependent and it might work well in some environments, but we should question whether it works well for the 70% that is currently serving at the moment. Now I want to think a little bit about future trends and how the future is changing and how that might impact the future of the design and function of these spaces. So first of all, I want to look at people and technology and then think a little bit about how that might impact space. Thinking about people to start off with, the first thing we have to recognize is that our workplaces are becoming much more diverse places. Thinking about this organization alone, we have people here working from all across the world with different cultural expectations, different requirements, and so forth. So the diversity of cultures is increasing through global migration of labor and so forth. The second thing is the diversity in generations. So if you think about younger people coming into the workforce, older people working for longer, that generational spread is increasing. So there's more people from different generations, which again have different expectations. If we think about the aging population in specific, by 2025, 30% of the EU population will be 65 years or older. 30% of the EU population. A huge proportion of us will be fitting into that category, and that will mean that workplaces again have to respond to that because as you get older, you're more sensitive to noise, you could require different lighting levels and so forth. So it's very, very important to think about that group when it comes to future requirements. This is a picture of my daughter reading BBC News on my iPad. It took me ages to get the image to look like that. She was biting it, she was throwing it through the air, she was doing all kinds of things with it, so I'm quite proud of that image. But this is my benchmark for when I think about the future, when I think about future requirements. Because what is normal for me and what is normal for you will not be normal for my daughter. So this new normal is what we constantly have to remind ourselves of. My daughter might never know a screen that you can't control through gesture. She might never pay with cash. She will never know a phone with a cord. This is the new normal, and these are the type of generations we have to consider when it comes to the future workplace. Another thing that is changing is how and where we work. Project-based work, nomadic work, flexible working. This is me working on this presentation on a Friday evening. Being German, I do have a glass of Jägermeister there to help me with the pain. But it's very, very normal for all of us to work in these type of environments, to work at home, to work at different times, because the flexibility that our workplaces offer have both the benefits and the negative sides of that in terms of how our lifestyles are organized. You will all know this as working on the road, working in airports, working in third spaces. A lot of work now happens in places that are not your desk. I would say actually the predominant component of my work certainly happens not on my desk. And that's, again, important to recognize when it comes to workplace design. And people actually spend less than 50% of the workday at their desks. And if I think about the proportion of spaces in this office and our office across the road, it's certainly not 50-50 when it comes to workstations and shared spaces. So that's, again, very, very important to consider how people work in an office environment. Technology, mobile technology, cloud computing, more powerful devices. All of this means that productivity is no longer location dependent. So the technology is the big, big enabler in terms of how we will work and how we can work going forward. And as I said, that is causing lifestyle changes, and it's causing some people to be stressed all the time, be in risk of burnout because we're constantly online, we're 24/7, and work is all around us all the time. And it's interesting, actually, that in Germany, where the labor unions are very, very strong, they're now introducing policies to actually combat that. So if you work at VW, your BlackBerry function automatically gets switched off half an hour after the workday ends. Isn't that something we would all love? I would certainly appreciate it because, I'm addicted to my emails. I will happily admit it, and it's a big, big problem, and I think quite a few of you are probably the same. Technology in spaces and how spaces are designed and understood is also changing. This is quite a nice little example of how consumer technology is advancing. It's a little solution called Cube Sensors, and you can buy this online. You can buy a bunch of these sensors for about 200 quid, and they measure all kinds of factors around the health of the environment that you're in: pressure, noise, glare, humidity, and so forth, and gives you a very, very simple reading of how healthy your home environment or your work environment is. And these kind of consumer technologies are now available to all kinds of people. And interestingly, as this moves into the home and into our private lives, there will be a greater expectation for our workstations and workplaces also to supply this information. I would love to know how healthy the environment is across the road in terms of real-time information and data. Thinking a little bit further into the future of where all this data and this massive data which we can collect around people, spaces, and technologies is heading. This is a prototype by a startup in California called MC10, and the technology is called Biostamp, and it's essentially an electronic tattoo that you simply stick on your skin, and it measures all kinds of vitals and factors such as your heart rate, your perspiration levels, your UV exposure. And the vision of this company really is that the ambulance will stop next to you before you're having a heart attack. So predictive health, helping you out, and so forth. And this is happening, this is real, they're working on it, and this is the granularity of data that we will have about people and spaces going forward. So where's all this heading? We're getting much more better at the sensors, we're getting much better at collecting data, we're getting much, much better at the analytics and creating insights out of that data. And crucially, for us in the built environment, we are now starting to develop systems that can respond to these insights. And for me, in many ways, that was the missing link for a long time. Lighting systems now, cooling, heating systems, all of these systems are now much more responsive and reactive and can be integrated into the system in a more intelligent way. And that's, again, where workplaces, as the patterns of work get more diverse in the future, we'll be able to utilize this to create more reactive and intelligent spaces. So what's the future and what's this implications? What are the implications in terms of future workplace design? Now, the first thing I like to say is that mobile IT is becoming more important than fixed IT. And that has implications for the design of offices because theoretically you need less server space, you need less fixed workstations and so forth. This is a power plant which supports a large Google server farm, and so much of this technology is now moving into the cloud that, again, even quite difficult calculations that previously required a powerful desktop can now be done in the cloud, can now be done on mobile, and that, again, has implications on spatial design. The second factor is that virtual platforms are now becoming as important as physical platforms. If we think about how work works inside Arup, and we've got this great thing called skills networks, where, for example, you can go into the acoustic skills networks and you can ask the whole of the group of acoustics experts across the Arup world a question related to a project or solution you're looking for. And you're much more likely to gain a good answer from that than you probably are from asking your colleague 2 or 3 rows down, because you're able to ask the whole of this virtual network for advice. There's other examples. There's this law firm in DC called ClearSpire, and 99% of their attorneys actually work from home because they've got this virtual home office application which allows them to do that. And they do have office spaces, but they are only for meetings with clients and they're only for meetings with other attorneys. Shared space is becoming more important than personal space. Again, a very, very important point. If you think about a company like Google, they invest a lot in shared space, in great and diverse shared space. They've got private workstations, but they're very cramped, they're very small, and so forth. So shared space is much more important because they recognize that they cannot understand or they cannot know the diversity of tasks that are happening inside their company. It's simply impossible. People are so diverse when it comes to their working patterns that the only thing they can do to respond to that is give people choice in how and where they work. Workplaces are also becoming more like homes. We all know that the office is moving into the home, but it's a two-directional relationship. The home is also moving into the office. And we're now moving towards these office landscapes, if you like, which have got much more comfortable furnishing, which are a lot more soft, a lot more friendly, and not the hard rows of benches which we see in most places today. And it's again a reflection of changing working styles and a consideration of different types of spaces that people may require. The ultimate extreme of this is this example here of Rabobank. Rabobank has got this program which is basically activity-based working in non-territorial spaces. They've got the HQ in Utrecht in the Netherlands. They've got 8,500 people working there, and no one has a fixed desk. 8,500 people, no one has a fixed desk. You arrive in the morning, you choose the space depending on the team you're working with at the time, or the task you're doing, or whatever working environment suits your needs. And they actually, I think, only have about 4,000 or 500 actual workplaces because they, again, recognize that people travel all the time, they're on the go, they're at client meetings, they're out and about, and to increase the utilization of this space, this non-territorial approach is actually really interesting. Interestingly, if you read the study about this, it says that younger employees had much more of a problem with it than older employees, because the younger employees then suddenly had lost the ability to have contact with or sit next to a more senior person. And that was a big issue when it came to this. But overall, on the whole, increased job satisfaction, increased productivity, and so forth. So quite a positive thing for Rabobank itself. This is Macquarie Bank. Another interesting example is their Sydney offices. They have taken a slightly different approach. They've got these adaptable neighbourhoods for 100 staff. So you've got these neighbourhoods where people from the same department or similar departments sit together, and they have the ability to shape the design of that neighbourhood depending to their needs. So it's again about giving people choice, giving people adaptability of space, rather than being too prescriptive. And this adaptability and flexibility is the only thing you can really do if you cannot understand how people are working and the diverse needs that are found in the office. Thinking about our own spaces and how we design spaces, if work is so much more varied and if spaces change all the time and the density changes all the time, we also have to think about how building systems need to respond to this. And this can be anything from the lift systems to the entry and exit doors to the lighting systems and so forth. We need to think, really rethink the assumptions that we use to design spaces. So, for example, the 9 a.m. rush in the morning might have to be replaced by the 12 o'clock rush inside and outside the building when it comes to lunchtime. So really rethinking how these changing working patterns could impact the operation of the building. And overall workplaces, as productivity of the individual becomes less important, workplaces are moving more towards branding and culture. So the new Siemens headquarters in Munich is all about showcasing Siemens technology, being a transparent company, being an inclusive company, allowing the general public to walk through the office space. There's very little that has impacted into design that was actually about individual worker productivity. And it was much more about culture and branding. And that is probably the case for a lot of flagship offices that are being built today. And finally, I think where we then are moving to when it comes to developers and so forth is some kind of new flavor of vanilla offices. Maybe with a little bit of a simpler fit out, but a greater focus on style, where flexibility and adaptability is inherent in the design to allow these different working styles to happen and to really move beyond the standard open plan design which we see everywhere right now. Why is all of this happening? Again, in summary, the patterns of work are changing faster than the shape of the building. So the only way we can respond to this is adaptability. Otherwise, we create and build structures that have to be knocked down again and have to be replaced. So adaptability is a key thing to consider when we create new spaces. In conclusion, this is not a black and white issue, and I'm not saying that open plan is all bad. It's all about proportions. The key thing we have to do as organizations is analyze the market, analyze the context, analyze the trends, and analyze the people in the space, their lifestyles and their behavioral patterns. The second thing we have to consider is that higher density doesn't have to be a bad thing. If you think about Rabobank, they've got extremely high density, but the space is actually really great because it gives people choice. And then it's all about space and proportions of space. It's okay to have open plan, but think about the shared spaces becoming much more important and how those can be designed in a better way. Again, in our offices, it's impossible to get a meeting space, for meetings unless you book weeks in advance. And that's a huge problem, I think, that we need to address. And then finally, it's all about choice. If we enable choice among the workforce, they will make their own right choices, and their productivity, satisfaction, well-being, and health will improve at the same time. Finally, going back to my roots as a biologist, I just want to finish with this quote, and that it says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change." And that is also true for the spaces and buildings that we design. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Can you say a little bit about the data on which your conclusions are based? You've talked a lot and made a lot of assertions about the kind of choice that we want. And I imagine that a company like Arup is using analytical data and survey and desk occupancy data and data about the choices that people want. What are you doing in that respect? Because many of the things that you're talking about are not new ideas, and we've been trying them in different ways. But we're not quite sure whether they're right or not.
No, you're absolutely right. So, personally, I love anecdotal evidence, but that's not going to be the right answer to your question. There is a range of studies out there that look at this in quite some detail. There's scientific studies which analyze the implications of the workplace, and I can point you to those afterwards if you're interested in terms of what they are. There's evidence around the density and so forth. But in terms of what we do as a firm, we do a lot of post-occupancy evaluation. And that gives us some quite granular data about how people perceive spaces. And we're actually just right now learning or trying to understand how we can also make more sense of that data. Because, again, getting back to this data analytics, we're now moving ahead so fast with big data that these data sets which we have about spaces, whether it's a post-occupancy survey or other types of information, can be analysed and queried in new types of ways. So yes, there is evidence behind it, but when it comes to a topic like this, which is all very much, something personal for me and for all of you, actually, I don't think, using anecdotal evidence is something we should shy away from, because, the expertise that we understand in terms of how spaces should be designed can actually be as valuable as seeing a graph that shows greater density over time.
You showed some beautiful images of some quite innovative forms of space.
Yeah.
There's one with an atrium with sort of cube offices flying into it. I look at that and I say, actually, that's a building in which density is relatively low, and certainly construction cost for number of people is not the primary concern of the client. It'd be really useful to be able to set those kinds of images of space that you show against the sort of metrics that are being asked for here. And to actually make it public. So you do post-occupancy evaluation, do Arup publish?
I don't know whether that's something we're planning in the long term, something I can discuss with the team working on this. But I think you're certainly right, and it's a question worth asking whether these kind of analyses can be done for all types of commercial offices, and in what way, because the examples I've shown are probably all relative, well, not extreme, but they're specific examples. The Rabobank example is certainly extreme. There's not many organizations who will have 8,500 people working in a space completely non-territorial. But they do show that some organizations, at least, are taking the risk to do things very, very differently. I think that's the interesting thing, because it's really hard designing a great office space. It's not a trivial thing. It's really, really difficult. And I think sometimes just having open plan, fixed desks with shared meeting spaces is just a simple way out. It's what we know. And we want to really question and challenge that through new forms of design. And then having an understanding of the data behind these things, and in particular post-occupancy, will be really, really useful going forward. I think maybe we're not quite there yet, in general, as the industry, to understand that, but we will be going forward, I think. Yes.
And if I can follow up on that, I'd be very interested to see or to hear your views on where you think user engagement is going, because I think it's quite an important topic that quite often the industry is not really looking at what the users want?
Yes.
And how do you bring that kind of perspective into the whole kind of bigger picture of collecting data and then designing office space? Where would you see that going?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I worked on the European Investment Bank workplace strategy, and they had previously made a change and they hadn't consulted people, and people were really, really unhappy. So that was one of the key things that we tried to address for that particular project, is trying to engage people. And that was done via surveys, which gives you the hard data, but it was also done by just creating a space for a whole week. There was a space where people could come and leave their ideas about what they wanted and didn't want. We had this open walk-in workshop, we called it. People just suck up their ideas, and we had a visual artist there, and we created a massive mural of everyone's needs and desires. And people really felt that they were engaged in the process, and I think that's absolutely critical, because it's a lifestyle-related thing and it's a people-related thing. If we don't engage the people, then we're certainly not on the right track. Shall we have one final question? Okay. We'll have two questions. that was so loud, I can't ignore that. Sorry.
Walk that end of the room a bit, because you've been taking all from this.
All right. Well, we'll start with that now. You can have the final word.
Okay, just a quick question. You talked a lot about the design of the interior of office space.
Yes.
I wonder if you looked at anything about where firms choose to locate. I mean, thinking back sort of 20 years ago, sort of office campuses were the new big thing and everybody wanted one. Now that seems to be very passé and people are wanting to be in clusters and hubs. I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
I do think location is also becoming much more important today for a variety of reasons. That is why London is such a great place to work, because of the clustering of innovation and talent and so forth. If you think about the example of the European Investment Bank, it's based in Luxembourg, and they're trying to attract top bankers from across the EU. So the only way they can do that is by creating an amazing space. So they've got a swimming pool, they've got a gym, they've got a shop, they've got a bank, they've got amazing canteens, they've got amazing outdoors. And that's what you can do, when it comes to a campus like that where space isn't a premium. But location inside of cities like London is absolutely crucial, because that's where the talent clusters. And we now live in a world where innovation and value creation is not insular anymore. It's really, really collaborative in terms of how companies work with each other. And that's where the clustering and location becomes really important. Also, if you want to attract the best talent, being in a city like London makes it a lot easier than being somewhere else. So I completely agree with your point. To you.
Hi.
Hi.
You talked a lot about how occupiers use space, but what impact do you think this change in workplace sort of trends has on the space that developers should be building? Specifically in terms of base build specification, particularly around the density in which we build to?
That's a really important question, and I thought about this a lot, and I also spoke with my colleagues about it a lot. And the interesting question is the proportion to which developers might, in the long term, actually start to maybe impact the fit out or the specifications a little bit more. Because, for example, if we think about the data analytics part and understanding more about the asset that you have, as a developer who has multiple assets across multiple locations, being able to compare and contrast that data then becomes really, really interesting, which means that maybe when it comes, for example, to the fit out of sensors and IT infrastructure and so forth, you do want to take a greater role in that, so you can also facilitate this kind of spread across the assets. And in general, simplicity, adaptability will be the key words. Flexibility is another word which is interesting, but designing for flexibility actually costs a lot of money, I think. Designing for adaptability is actually more interesting, where you create spaces that are easily adaptable and thereby kind of, don't have the huge capital costs at the beginning. Thank you so much for your comments and for listening. I'm now going to hand back to Farah for some final words. Thank you very much.
I thought it was a really inspiring and interesting talk. What I quite liked was that he took a very different perspective. So I would have thought someone with an architecture background or workplace consultancy background would talk to us today. And I thought it was really interesting to see his perspective on doing trends and doing research in that kind of area. I'm a lecturer in complex buildings at UCL, and this research is quite close to what I do as well. So I'm interested in usage, I'm interested in how people use space, how we design office buildings. And I thought that was quite nice to see that perspective.
I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was actually more like a precursor to something that could have been much more wider and has Mark mentioned earlier, we could have had a lot more. I think they could have been a little bit more in some of the in depth in terms of some of the topics, especially space, the proportions, what that actually means in terms of the workspace. If you're going to make spaces more dense because you can have more users in there doing different things, but also, and again, in terms of the data collection, because of its big data, what do you collect and what would actually be really useful? Who knows what is going to be useful to the end user, to the developer, to the occupier, to the organisation, etc. So, and also really, a lot of the stuff that was shown was kind of, I wouldn't exactly say cutting edge. It was kind of nearly there, but not quite. I think it would have been interesting to see more detail of the examples of what Rabobank are doing in particular. Is there anybody with truly adaptable space? If so, how? And as my colleague Helen asked, what are the lessons for developers like ourselves?
I work for the Finland Trade Commission, and as you may know, Finland is basically very much involved in sustainable energy and clean tech. So anything related to those particular areas of interest are of value to us, because then we can feed this information back to Finland, and it provides an opportunity for us in terms of key drivers in the marketplace.
I'm an architect by sort of training. I was quite interested to find out where he thought the impacts were going in terms of built environment. And I don't think we had time to quite get onto that, but the discussions about sort of interaction between the layering of technology and space was all really good. And I think what I would have been interested to know is how the data collection was maybe going to be started and what sort of parameters he would have been looking at. But yeah, it was a great talk. That was very interesting.